Hello everyone. Welcome to our Ingham Institute Postdoctoral Association event. We're really lucky to have a great presenter who's going to talk to us about how to present an academic CV. Professor Afaf Girgis is the director of the Psycho-Oncology Research Group at the Ingham Institute for Applied Medical Research and at the UNSW in Sydney. She's worked for more than 30 years as a behavioural scientist in cancer control and psycho-oncology, and she has received numerous awards for her work. In 2019, she became a member of the Order of Australia for significant service in cancer control and psycho-oncology. Afaf is committed to training junior researchers to become our future workforce and works closely with clinicians and cancer centres to translate research findings into practice. So I'm going to hand it over to Afaf. Hopefully we'll have time for questions and discussion. And if you'd like to just put questions or, just sort of note in the chat that you would like to ask a question, and then we'll go through them at, when we can. Over to you.
Okay, lovely. Now I am going to whip through some of this so we do have time for questions at the end. And I'm also assuming that you'll be able to get a copy of the PowerPoints in a PDF format. So I've kind of included lots of information thinking that you can refer back to it later rather than going through everything that I put on the slides. So I'll just get started. So thank you again for the invitation to do this. It's lovely to give you some of my perspective about what's important to include in a CV, but also what I've heard from others as I've learned those things over the last 30 years or so. So what I'm going to cover today is just very briefly, what's the difference between a resume and a CV? What are the main CV headings? Talking a bit about the presentation because it absolutely matters. And then really just giving you some tips for keeping your documents application ready so that you're not scrounging around trying to get your CV in order when you really should be focused on working on a particular grant, for example. A few declarations up front. I'm using examples from CVs that have been shared with me, and thank you to the people who sent me CVs the last time I did this presentation. Don't take it personally if I highlight something from your particular CV on the screen. This is really everything I say is meant to be constructive. And also just saying my opinions are not gospel. So this is my experience and what I've learned over the years about what to include in an academic CV, but there might be some different opinions out there, which, it would be helpful for you to know about over time as well. So just very briefly, differences between a resume and a CV. A resume is essentially just a very brief 1 to 2 page document that presents the key facts about your professional experience, any educational background that's relevant to what you're applying for, and skills, etc. So it's a very punchy 1 to 2 page document. A CV, on the other hand, which is largely what we're talking about today, is a longer document that basically details the whole course of your career. Now, for some of you that might be 2 pages at the moment, but over time that will develop, and that's the document that you keep adding to as your career develops, and to make sure that it's a comprehensive document of your whole course of your career. In our professions, though, we need to make sure that we're always ready with a few different documents. So you need your full CV, which is your whole career story. You need to have at the ready a 2 page resume, which is a summary of your work over the past 5 years. And I'll talk about both the CV and the 2 page resume because I've been requested specifically to focus on that. Often you're asked for just a one-page resume as well, and that's an overall career summary. So that's another document to have ready as well. And if you're someone who's presenting at conferences and so on, though that's been very minimal over the last 18 months or so, but it's good to have a bio that's ready for conference presentations when people want to introduce you. And again, you can update that on a regular basis as well, but it's good just to have one ready that you can update rather than having to start from scratch. So launching into CVs, the first thing we think about is the headings and the order of the headings. Now, some years ago, I went over to the university because I was thinking about a particular application for a fellowship type application. And they said to me, you know, the order of how you present your CV is important. And basically, this is what the take-home message is. Right up front, there's just the very personal details about, you know, your personal details and your contact details, professional appointments, etc., come right at the front of your CV. But the next section is really important, and I didn't have mine in this order when I spoke to them, and I ended up moving things around as per their advice. So what they said was the next set of things that you include in your CV are outcomes that show that you're highly judged or valued by others in the field. So they're really those competitive things like, you know, what awards have you been receiving? What grants have you been successful in getting? Any invited presentations, for example. So they're things that have been judged by externals to show that you've got value in this particular field. And then the last section of your CV, which is probably the bulk of the CV, is going to be things that you control. So they're things like, you know, teaching roles that you've had, other conference presentations that you've had, any external reviews or theses marking or whatever that you've said yes to, and any publications. So publications, we send them off to get them published. They're not something, and yes, they need to get over the line to be accepted, but they're not things where you've been specifically invited to do something. So that's kind of the order of things that they recommended. Now, presentation really does matter. In terms of length, there's literally no limits because, as I said, over time, your CV will grow. And if you look at that, mine is, I don't know, about 140 pages long or something, which I just want to poke my eyes out before I'd have to read it. But to others in the field, that might be quite important. And it does show the extent of work that you've done over the years. And, you know, obviously you start small, but it will develop over time. So length, it doesn't really matter. The structure, though, does matter. The order of headings, as I've said before, in terms of the blocks of headings, and I'll go through those with you in a moment. Make it easy to read. So, you know, this is not the time to clutter it with pictures and fancy designs and so on. You need to make it really easy to read with some, you know, white sections that really make it easy to flow from one section to the other. Use bullet points, use tables, use headings, highlight things that are important. So think about the presentation. In terms of order, it is important to do reverse order so that we can say, okay, what's this person currently doing? And then work backwards from there about what they've done most recently, and then back to what are the very first things that you've done. And it is important to be consistent with that. So don't use reverse order in one section and a different order in another section. You do need consistency. The other thing to be consistent about is how you highlight yourself in the CV. So, you know, all your publications either use bold to highlight your name or underline your name. Whichever you use, just be consistent throughout your CV. Paying attention to details. So finding spelling mistakes is always off-putting, because what that does is to the reader, it kind of says, okay, well, if their attention to detail in their CV, which is what they're using to sell themselves to me, is not quite up to standard, what does that say about potentially about their work? So, you know, people make judgments about all sorts of things, and that's one of them. Avoid acronyms and shorthand. We each have our own, in our own disciplines, we've got our acronyms, we've got our particular phrases that are very common to us but might not be known in other fields. Assume that someone reading your CV isn't from your field. You know, they might be the community member who's on a panel, for example, or they might be someone from outside of your field, and just don't include anything in your CV that they look at it and think, well, I don't know what that means. So just going through the sections, the personal details, I think this is critically important that you avoid oversharing. So, you know, as I said before, people make judgments, people have unintended biases that result from looking at things. So it's important that you don't overshare. So include in your CV all the things that are important, particularly in terms of how do they contact you? Are there particular things about you that might be relevant in your work? For example, do you speak another language? Do you have Australian citizenship? Because that might impact whether, you know, an employer can or can't employ you, for example, or what they need to do to be able to employ you if you're not an Australian citizen. So only include things in that section that are relevant. There's no need to show photos or birth dates, birthplaces, marital status. None of that is important in a CV, or not so much important, but not relevant in a CV, and it may lead to unintended biases. Include your professional email address. So that's important as well. You know, most of us have a personal email address as well, but for a CV, it's important that it's your professional email address. And only include relevant information that doesn't need to stay confidential. For example, one of the CVs that I saw had the radiation license number. Now, I don't know if that's an important thing to have in that particular field. I obviously come from a very different field, but to me, looking at it, it seemed like it's something that should stay confidential. So have a think about that. And all our fields are different. So I'm speaking from the perspective of my kind of field. So the section on education, it is important to be comprehensive with the information that you include here. So I've included a few examples there of bits that I've pulled out of a few different CVs. So for each degree that you list the institution, the location, the type of degree, and the date of graduation. It is important that you include all of those things. Avoid acronyms. Give me the title of your thesis, because, you know, you might have changed slightly in the types of fields that you're working in. So people need to know what was your main thesis about. If relevant, include the supervisors. So I've included down the bottom the education bit that came from Dr. Ben Smith's CV. Now, he works in my field. And as soon as I saw those supervisors, I knew that Ben would have been trained well, because I knew those supervisors and I knew that they've got very high standards. So I can already make a judgment based on the PhD title and the supervisors that this person would be a good fit for working in my particular group. So they're the sorts of things that you can think about when you're including information about the education part of your CV. Employment details also include conjoint roles, because again, that shows value that you've been appointed as a conjoint in particular institutions. You might not be paid for it, but your work is valued in those institutions because you've been given that conjoint appointment. If you have an extensive employment history, then consider whether you have two sections, a current section and a previous section. So in my CV, I've got that. In this one, which is Ben's CV, he doesn't because he's still, you know, kind of early to mid-career. If you're involved in things like teaching, research, clinical roles, those might be good headings to break up your employment status as well, so that people can very quickly go to the relevant section of your employment to say, okay, well, in the clinical roles, I can see the person has done X, Y, Z. If you're more junior, then including, or if you've got a position title that doesn't necessarily easily reflect the sort of work that you do, then consider adding a kind of role description briefly here. So again, you can see that Ben has put in a fairly brief description of what a translational research fellow actually means. And then later on in his CV, he's got a section that talks about research experience. And for each of his current roles and previous roles, he goes into much more detail about what the responsibilities were, what his key roles were, etc. So that might be something that you consider doing. I certainly, you know, am not doing it in my CV, but that's because mine's a longer CV. But for someone more junior who's looking to, say, get promoted or apply for particular grants where that kind of information is useful, then that might be something that you consider doing. Now, awards are really important because you've been judged by someone externally to have done, you know, something outstanding that deserved to be, you know, you've competitively received an award, and that could be prizes, it could be travel awards, it could be education awards, anything at all that's got your name in it, even if you are not the first investigator on that, you are part of the team that got that award. So don't leave it out. So I've included examples here to show you. One of our staff got a travel award for this, the ones that I've highlighted with red there. And so both myself and Ben have got it on our CVs because we're named as part of that team. I didn't personally use the travel award, but the team received you know, the award in terms of that's the work that was done by the team. So if you're named on anything, include it in your CV. Don't be shy about including those things. And that might be poster awards, it might be, you know, particular scholarships that you got, travel awards, etc., as I said. The other thing is, importantly, don't bury them. So some of the CVs I got sent and I kind of looked through them and I thought, oh, okay, in the training section, they've actually got awards as well. Well, training is very different to awards. Awards are highly competitive. Training is something that you choose to do. So separate them out, don't bury them, don't have people looking for them. And again, at the bottom of that red block, this is out of someone else's CV, they've got author of winning submission for Southwest Sydney LHD Quality Award. Now, that's actually a big deal, having applied for those. They're quite competitive and they're a big deal. So instead of that one-liner buried in the training section, have a look at the bottom one, which is in the green, which is the other way that we've presented awards like that in the CVs that I mentioned just previously. So highlight them, don't bury them. And again, in another CV that I read, they were mixed in with oral presentations. So if you got the best student presentation, you know, jump up and down about it. It's important, particularly for that stage of your career. First place winner, best presentation winner, best presentation, third place winner, all of those things can be listed, yes, in your oral presentations as well, but put them in the awards section as well, because people will pay more attention to that and they'll easily find them. You know, I went through the CVs with a fine-tooth comb, but people reading your CV as part of an overall application, for example, where there's a lot of other information that you're submitting, are probably going to skim them. So they might miss those important things if they're buried. Research funding. Now, every CV I've looked at has a different format for presenting research funding. So the important thing is pick one format and then be consistent. This is out of my particular CV, and the bits that I've highlighted in yellow there are for me to check whether that award, that grant is for those particular years before I lock it in. So when you're editing your CV, keep things highlighted that you're not 100% sure about, or you need to check information so that you can go back and edit it. But I guess the important things for me, I found using a table format was convenient and easy, largely because sometimes I'm asked, for example, to extract the number of dollars for a particular block of time. So what I can do is I can quickly go down the right-hand column there, pick all the numbers relating to that block of years, put them in an Excel and get a tally up without having to manually add up all those numbers. So for me, that works. For other people, there are different formats. But whatever you do, I would strongly recommend having that summary statement right at the top of your grants and consultancies. And if you've received consultancies, put them in there as well. So, anything where you received any money for anything at all, whether it be a travel grant, a prize for a best poster presentation, anything at all where there's money come to you from any source is essentially a grant or a consultancy of some variety. So count them, even if it's $1,500 for a travel grant, put it in your grants section. So up the top, I've got the grand total, the number of grants, as well as the amount of funding. And I update that amount every time I enter in a grant so that it's very easily accessible if I need that information. So other formats that people have used, or, these are some examples of other formats. But what I want to highlight is, again, in the way you present it. So you'll see when I presented mine, I had the funds per year as well as the total funds. Sometimes you'll be asked to report total funds. Sometimes you'll be asked to report, all the money that you received in a particular year. So again, for me, that makes it very easy to extract that information. So I'm thinking about what's going to make it easier for me to extract the information required by different bodies. This is a different format, but I'll give you a few examples of how you word things. So for example, in the top one there, the person has said $10,000 per year for 3 years. But if you actually say $30,000 and then put in brackets the years that it is, it sounds much more impressive. It's the same amount of money, but reading it, you get the $30,000 as opposed to the $10,000, which again, if you're skimming it, you might miss that, yes, it actually adds up to $30,000 because it's 3 years. So think about how to present. And again, the bottom one, and I've got Ben's permission to use his CV, so I'm not picking on him in this presentation. But, Ben's got in there the total number of dollars that, for the grants, and also the total number of dollars for him as a CI on the grants that he's listed. But I actually went through and counted the number of grants, and he's on 19 grants, which is pretty impressive for someone at his career level. So include that in your summary statement up top so people don't have to go and count for themselves. So as I said in the yellow box here, don't make the reader fish for the information or have to go and tally things up, because often when you're reviewing things as a reviewer, you haven't got a lot of time to go through each little bit of things that people send you. So spoon feed people, summarize things right up front, and then give them the detail. But on grants, and I have read CVs where it's only got that person's name listed, and I'm thinking, well, grants are rarely a one-person show. They're most often a team application. So who are the other CVs that, who are the other CIs that are on that grant? Make sure you always include all of the CIs. And if you're one of the associate investigators, then put that in there as well, because you're part of an overall team, particularly if you're more junior. You need the title of the grant, you need the funding body, the years that it's awarded, and the funds awarded. That's the minimum information that you should have on any grants that you list in your CV. So moving on to conference presentations, if you're named on it at all, then include it. Even if you're the 10th person who's listed on a conference presentation, you're still part of that research that's being presented. So don't limit it to only those that are your personal presentations. List the names of all of the authors and list them in, list your conference presentations in reverse order with the most recent first. And in terms of invited presentations and other conference roles, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, obviously there you will only claim your own because you are the one who got invited. So, if Ben got invited to do a presentation, even if there's a team group on there, I wouldn't list it in my invited presentations. I would list it in my other presentations. Everything else that you present listed under other conference presentations that are later in your CV. Now, my personal tip is you don't need a separate section for poster presentations. They are competitively, not competitively, but they've been reviewed in the same way that your other presentations have been reviewed and selected to be in a particular conference. So you just need to put in brackets that it was a poster presentation. You don't need to give them a whole other section and highlight it. That's my view. So invited. So I've got a section that's conference and workshop invitations. And in that, I've got things like invited speaker, plenary speaker, session chair, organizer, reviewer, any of those roles that someone has said, Vicky, would you please take on the role of chairing this particular session? So you've been invited to take on a particular role. So all of those things go in that particular section. So it's not only where you're invited as a keynote presentation or presenter, it's all of the sorts of roles that you might do in an invited capacity can go in that section. And then after that, your other conference presentations and posters, and they basically just go in reverse chronological order. And you'll see there that a lot of those I am not listed first, and that's perfectly okay. Sometimes in those I'm a team member. Sometimes in those, I'm the kind of the senior author of the group, and in which case I would be listed last. So, and again, you'll see there that I've put poster in brackets if it was a poster, but I haven't given it a separate section all its own. If your particular presentation has been highlighted in the program, for example, best of the best orals, that's important because that's kind of a step up from a regular presentation. So any information that's important like that, include it in your CV. This is an alternative format. So again, this comes from Ben's, and he has different sections. So he's got invited orals, he's got competitively selected orals, and then he's got posters, and then he's got media presentations. Whatever format you choose, just make sure that you're consistent with how you present it. And as I've said, a number of times, don't make the reader fish for information. So absolutely don't include your invited things as part of your overall presentations, because they do deserve to be highlighted. Now, leadership roles, you know, this is one of those areas where, again, your CV might start out small in those areas and then it might expand. So, you know, you might be on some regional committees, you know, for example, do you chair the ECR group? Is that on your CV? Well, if it isn't, it should be. Do you chair a particular other group in your organisation? Anything like that is important to include. And as you progress to more senior roles, you can include, for example, university level positions or LHD level positions if you get those. And ultimately, you know, there might be a statewide or international committees and things that you're on. I like to see what's current by highlighting it. So, you know, and again, mine are reverse chronological order. So the most recent one I got on would be at the top of my lists, and I've got them in sections. So I've got, you know, international, national, state, and university regional sections. But again, you might not break it up into those right now, but over time, as your sections get bigger, you might break it up, or there might be some particular things relevant to your role, which might be clinical leadership roles, for example, that you want to highlight. Again, just be consistent. So, and if you're not quite sure what to put in there, ask for some of your senior people to have a quick look at their CVs and see what sorts of things they've got in there that you could maybe put in yours as well. External reviews, that's kind of the giving back section. What are you doing to give back to your particular discipline, to your organisation, etc.? And, you know, I don't these days keep this very much up to date, but I think in more junior roles, and I'll show you another alternative way of presenting this. So are there particular grants that you've reviewed over the years? As I said, mine are not current. Have you been invited to review programs of work, for example? A particular teaching program or a particular research program, you know, whatever's relevant for your particular discipline. So have a think about that. Are there journals that you do reviews for? And you know, at early stages of your career, I would include the journals that you've reviewed for, and I'd update them whenever, or not update them, but add to that list every time you get asked to do a review and you do a review. Are there student theses that you've marked, for example? They could be honours theses, they could be master's or PhD, depending on where you're at in your career. So that's the place to report anything that's a giving back. And, you know, this is another, this is what from one of the other CVs that was sent to me, and it was listed under a contribution to professional activities. So whatever title you give it, just make sure that it's clear what you're including in there. But avoid acronyms. I mean, I still to this day am not sure what that means, but, you know, things like that where it may be read by someone else who is not in your discipline. It's important that you spell things out for people. Supervision and teaching. So this is quite important, again, because it's showing your contribution to the field, but it's also showing that you are at a senior enough level where you might be a co-supervisor on a particular ILP project, for example, or master's project or honours project, whatever it is, just, you know, make sure that you actually list that in your CV. Again, I've used you can see I'm a big fan of tables. I've used a tables approach just because I can put in the headings what needs to be reported back sometimes to various institutions, and then I can update the information, just add in another row and update the information. But It doesn't really matter what format you use. So, it could be listed PhDs, masters, honours, ILPs, and it could be, as per the one at the bottom, academic supervision versus teaching supervision. Whatever format you choose, just be consistent in the way you do it and provide all of the information that is needed to keep that up to date and to quickly cross-reference if you need to report on something. Publications, how are we doing for time? Yep. So publications, the subheadings to use are books. So if you're an editor on a book, and then if you've written a book chapter, peer-reviewed publications, published conference abstracts, and then other. So you might be involved in developing guidelines, for example, or other sorts of resources like that. Don't leave them off your CV because they are important. Reverse chronological order and make sure that you highlight your name so that people can easily find where you are in the list of authors. And if you have, I used to do this, but I don't do it anymore. If you have a lot of publications from your students or fellows that you're supervising, for example, you could highlight them as well in a different way to yours. Maybe highlight your name, underline there so that people can see that a lot of the work that you're publishing is also coming from your students. But that's kind of something, it's a personal thing. I used to do it when I was more junior and still trying to develop my track record where I wasn't the first author on publications, but I wanted to show that I was actually the supervisor of the first author. So again, thinking about that, that might be an option that you consider. So choose an accepted standard format. You can see there that there's different ways people have presented their publications. Choose an accepted standard format, in the way that publications are included in the reference section of papers, for example. Use a standard format and just apply that consistently. Only include in your CV if a paper has been accepted for publication or actually published or in press. So don't include things that you're working on or that are under editorial review. Only include if it's actually been accepted, and you can put in brackets accepted on whatever the date is. Whenever you get that first email that says, congratulations, we're happy to accept your paper, just put that date as the accepted date. Again, it's good having a summary statement, so peer-reviewed publications, and then in brackets, how many have you got in total, how many times it's been, your work's been cited, your H-index, all of that could just be in that quick line summary right up the top. Include add-ons if you can find them, so links if someone can click on that and it takes them straight to your publication. That's a nice thing to add. I personally wouldn't know how to do that, but obviously this person knew. So if there's things that make it easier for people to find your publication, I've included guidelines and reports from consultancies, for example, in my one, which is the bottom left one there. If you've written a chapter in a clinical practice guidelines, that's important. So put it in your CV, and there might be other things that are relevant to your particular field that are important publications to highlight. So training and skills that are relevant to your field. This is a very field-specific sort of section. What's important to you? So, it might be quite important that you've got skills in the particular latest, web development or particular IT skills or, radiation oncology type training or whatever it is. Think about what's important in your particular field and put it in there. workshops that you've done, for example, that are important to keep up your skills in your particular field, or make you stand out from others in your particular field. And then other potential sections, referees, you can either include them there or say that they can be provided on request. If I'm on a panel and people haven't included referees from their most recent workplaces, I always have alarm bells ringing, because I kind of think, what's going on there? If you're lucky enough to get to interview and you can explain why that is, that's fine. But if you don't have people from at least your current kind of workplace, then perhaps say can be provided on request if there's a reason that you might need to explain why you haven't included those people. Community talks, etc., could potentially go there. I actually include them in my presentation section rather than separately, but you might want to include them as a particular section. Again, it's a bit field specific. And think about anything else that's relevant to your particular field that you feel people really need to know about. So documents should always be application ready. The number of times I've had people say, you know, where I've emailed and said, can you flick me your 2-page CV because the grant is due in whatever amount of time. Oh gosh, just let me pull that together for you. And it's not ideal because it means that you're taking valuable time away from your grant writing to prepare a CV or a 2-pager that really should be at your fingertips all the time, ready to go. So the 3 documents I recommend that, you know, every time you publish something or you give a presentation or a new grant comes through or you take on a new student, update 3 documents, your CV, your 1-pager and your 2-pager, you know, pretty immediately. And I literally open up the 3 documents and I've got highlighted in yellow the things that need updating. And I just add one to the relevant section, close them again. It's all done within the space of 5 minutes. The 2-pager, I was asked to go into this in a bit more detail, so I'll quickly go through that. And I know we've only got about 17 minutes left, so I'll try and spend about 5 minutes on this and just whip through it so that you've got some questions. And I don't know if there's questions coming through because I can't see them, but if there are, I'll make sure are there questions coming through?
Yeah, there are about 4 questions so far.
All right, well, let me keep going and I'll just make sure there's time for those.
Yeah.
So bodies like NHMRC, if you've applied for those sorts of grants, will require a 2-page CV from all of the chief investigators. So that one is particularly important to keep up to date and to keep it in the format that's required by NHMRC. But sometimes that will also serve perfectly well if you're doing a cover letter for a job application, for example, and you want to include that brief resume, you know, ahead of the longer CV that you might also include. So I'll talk about that now. NHMRC template requires particular headings. So they want you to actually use those headings in your 2-pager. So what I recommend to people is, even if you're very early in your career, it's not a bad exercise to see about fitting your information under those headings. And I'll talk about what the headings mean using my CV as an example in a moment. But as your CV grows, it'll be easier to populate all of those headings. Some of them may not be relevant to you. Like in our field, we really don't have patents. That would be a very unusual thing in the psycho-oncology field. So that section is always, I just don't put it in that section. And there might be others that aren't particularly relevant to your field, but most of those you'll probably end up having something against. So I'm just going to whip through those sections for my 2-pager as an example, but because you're going to have these as a a handout that you can access. I'm not going to talk about them in a great deal of detail, but more that you can look back and see what sorts of things did I mention in those sections. So the career summary is an overall statement right at the beginning of that 2-pager, which is really about how many years have you worked in your field, what are your current appointments, awards, number of publications, number of citations, H index. So you can see that I've highlighted in yellow the things that I need to update on a regular basis. So before I flick my 2-pager to anyone who's writing a grant that needs me to send them my 2-pager, I will go through and just 100% check that I've got all of those things are up to date. So that's the career summary part. The research support is really about talking about the number of grants you've got, the total income, the types of funding, if you want to highlight that you've got a variety of different funding sources, for example, this is the space to do that. And also you can highlight here what the focus of your research is. So for me, I am focused much more on translational and health service research. And so I've highlighted in my research support that this is kind of my main focus of work at the moment. But, you know, again, discipline specific. So if there's a particular grant that you want to highlight, so in my, you know, we were applying for psycho-oncology type grants. So I wanted to highlight in this 2-page section, you know, the $2 million grant that we got for the Australian Cancer Research Foundation Survivorship Research Centre. Because, you know, for the sorts of grants I was applying for, that was an important thing to highlight. Contributions to the research field. So, you know, what are your particular contributions to your particular research field? And I use this to highlight, you know, the things that, and again, sometimes I'll change this for different grants, but mostly my grants that I'm a CI on, they've invited me to be a chief investigator on because of my work in particular areas. So I don't tend to change this very much. But I want to highlight that I work a lot in the patient-reported outcomes space. That's what I'm kind of known for locally and more internationally, and also the field of caregiver research. So I've commented on those 2 things in this particular section, but this might be the section where you think about, well, what's my particular contribution to the research field? You know, what would make me stand out as a go-to person in my research field? And this would be the section to highlight it in. Collaborations. You can get these sorts of metrics, and I'd suggest if you're not sure how to do it, because I actually can't remember how to do it, but the person from the library, so if you talk to the library, they can show you how to extract this particular information, such as what % of your publications included international collaborators. You know, who are your key collaborators, for example? And it doesn't have to be international. It could be people from other institutions. But this is where you might include things like that. What are the metrics around collaborations? Or if there's a particular group that you're collaborating with that you feel is quite important to highlight, this would be where you'd put it. Community engagement and participation. And those headings are straight from the NHMRC headings, and that's why I'm kind of focusing on what they might include. This is where you would include things like your track record of effective engagement with end users, consultancies that you want to highlight, for example. So here I've talked about you know, developing communication skills training over the decades, some of my patient-reported outcomes research and its impact on clinical practice, you know, what sorts of organisations you might be doing consultancies with that are helping improve their practice. That's the kind of area where you would talk about those. Professional involvements. So anything that you're on in terms of important working groups, committees, advisory groups, and putting in your most recent ones. Now, don't forget the 2-pager covers only the last 5 years. So this is an area where I go through and I delete anything that's, either now outside of that 5-year period, or I add in new appointments that I might have received that are worth noting since the last time I submitted a grant. So this section should be kept updated. International standing. So this is really about, what is your international standing? And it might be that, this section might be fairly small to start with, but over time it will develop. And one of the things I would recommend is have a look at each of these sections carefully and say, okay, well, I've got nothing in this area at the moment. What can I do to help build my CV in this particular area? So for some of my junior staff or people that I've mentored, I've actually asked to send their CVs to me so that I can look and say, okay, look, you've done more than enough to build up your track record in this particular area, but what you need to do is get on more committees, for example. So I've consciously done that, for example, with Ben, where I've said to him, okay, we need to increase your committee profile. I've been on this particular committee for a while, but now I think it's time for me to come off, but I'll nominate you to go in my place. So talk to your supervisors about ways that you can build up particular areas of your CV. Supervision and mentoring. Put your hand up to co-supervise a student, for example. Primary supervisors are always happy to have someone, a number of people co-supervising, because it reduces the workload on us, but it also means that we're training more junior people to eventually take the reins as primary supervisors. So again, keep this up to date. Any type of supervision that you're doing, honours, ILP, anything at all that you're doing can go in this section. Peer review involvement, this is the giving back. They want to see what you're doing. So anything at all, whether you're reviewing for journals or whether you're reviewing conference abstracts, anything at all that you're doing can go in here. And then the top 5 publications, they always ask for the top 5 publications in the last 5 years and why they were selected. Now, this is an area where, depending on what the focus of the grant is, I'll go through my CV and pick the most relevant publications to that particular grant. So, for example, here, it would have been a grant related to, patient-reported outcomes, for example. So I've picked the top 5 publications relating to that. And you can see here, I've just put the first 2 there to say, that you need to write something about why you've highlighted those particular publications. They might have received awards, or they might be highly cited, or they might be influential in your particular field, or they're reporting a new methodology, for example, that is important in your field. Whatever the reason is, use that to help choose the publications. It's not only about what journal they were published in or how many citations they've got. It might be something you've literally just published, but it's going to be important because of X, Y, Z. Now, last slide, if your CV is not up to date, stop procrastinating. While we're in lockdown, just go do it. Prepare your 1 and 2 pages while you're at it, and then keep all 3 documents up to date all the time. Just have a folder that's called CV with the 3 things in it. And every time you do something, open it, update the 3, and always be ready if someone invites you to be on a grant or you're developing one yourself. That's not what you want to be spending your time on. And finally, if it is good looking at other people's CVs. Like even in my field, I'll look at the 2 pages that come through if I'm collating a grant. And I think, oh, that's a good way of saying that. You know, people have different ways of expressing the information. So don't be shy about asking senior collaborators or whoever your boss is for a copy of their CV. It's not something that we're going to hold back sending to you. So absolutely, you know, go for it. And that's going to be the best way of learning what goes in there and how to express it in a way that's compelling. So I'm sorry, I haven't left a lot of time for questions, but hopefully I've covered a lot. But I'm happy to fire away at responses to questions, and I can email people as well if you.
Yep, great. Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Afaf. That was amazing, really constructive. We have got a few questions in the chat, and a couple of comments. So are you able to see the chat, or would you like me to?
Yep, I'll open that now. Being shortlisted for an award. Yes, absolutely. Yep. Yes, the answer to that. If you're shortlisted for an award, or even if you're nominated for one, if you're fairly junior, just being nominated for something is important as well. So yes, definitely. Named on grants, these are easy to write down. Sometimes we joint grant work and have a substantial role. Okay, so what I would do as part of your role description, you might then highlight some things that you're working on that are, you know, worth highlighting, like what I think this, what you're saying here. So you might not be named on the particular grant, but depending on how junior you are, again, in the grants section, you might write in a bit that says, not a named CI or AI, but my role is substantial in this way. So find a way of still saying it. Manuscripts on bio, RX, IV, I don't know what that is, sorry.
So there are sites where you can publish non-peer-reviewed manuscripts. So often people will publish on there while they're getting peer review.
I have not personally seen that. I probably would err away from it unless that's something quite common in your field. So obviously peer-reviewed, someone's looked at it to say it's scientifically sound, it's a good study, it ticks the boxes. If it's not peer-reviewed, I probably, as a reviewer, wouldn't be paying attention to it. So I'd push towards getting SciVal or Scopus, but aren't those...
I think that comment came when you were talking about finding out from the librarian about your reach or the percentage of, yeah, yes. So that's more of a comment.
Yes, okay. Talking to, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the librarians were so helpful, and I've wanted to update that section a couple of times, and then I kind of think I'll do it later, but I really should do it. And write down what the librarian says to how they say to do it. How should we account for the relative to opportunity? Okay. So when you're applying for a grant, so it depends whether you mean just in the CV, and I don't know if the person wants to jump on and actually talk about, sorry, I'm trying to read ahead. I'll focus on one thing at a time.
So that's a question from Shraddha. Do you want to clarify?
Yeah, is that all right? Hi,
yeah,
thanks for that talk. That's been fantastic.
Thank you.
What I meant was both in terms of the CV, but also in terms of the NHMRC 2-pager, because I work part-time as a clinician and as a part-time researcher, and that's what I've done for the last 6 years.
Yeah.
So I'd like to use some of my older publications in that last 5-year bit, but what's a succinct way of explaining that? Because I just don't have as many publications in the last 5 years because I've been working part-time.
Okay, so NHMRC are very strict about that. So when the grant gets reviewed by the submitting organisation, like in my case, it'd be UNSW, the grant officers will actually go through your grant and say you can't include this, or you can't include that, or you have to update this. They would probably want you to cull it at that point. So what I would do is I would make a statement in your career summary up the top. I'd make reference to the fact that your point whatever research as opposed to your clinical roles. So I'd highlight it there. But also in NHMRC grant, there's a section on relative to opportunity. And that's where if you've had career disruptions, for example, if you've had a couple of breaks for maternity leave, or you've had a couple of times where you've worked mostly clinically, in that section, this is where you elaborate on your career relative to opportunity, where you can highlight that. But you won't be able to put older than 5 years in your 2-pager, but you might be able to comment about it. So, maybe make a statement at the beginning of that 5 top publications to say that, you've got publications that are older than that, but the ones that are from the last 5 years are blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a way around it, because they're very black and white about only including things that are the last 5 years.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Can we get a summary of your notes? Well, you can certainly have a PDF of the presentation. As you can tell, I just babble along, so I don't have written notes. Happy to share your slides. Yep.
So there are a couple of questions just above. There was, how do we account for career breaks? Do we need to make it quite prominent?
I would definitely. I mean, reviewers are all given the hard line that we need to make sure that we're reviewing what we're looking at relative to opportunity. So if you've had career breaks, I'd probably put that in my career summary statement, that very first section that I presented. I'd probably just say it in that, but also make sure that you include it in that special section on relative to opportunity that is a different part of the grant application.
That was my question, sorry.
Okay.
Thanks for presenting this, by the way.
It's all right, pleasure.
So how do we do that in our CV though? Because for the grant I'm applying for, it's not an NHMRC one, so it doesn't have all of those relative to opportunity sections. So instead of just listing the employment with the dates, how do we make it a bit more prominent? Because I work clinically and in research as well, so I don't have many publications.
So I'd probably include that in your first section that talks about what your positions are. So, because sometimes I've looked at CVs and I've thought, oh, there's a bit of a break here. There's almost like a 3-year break. What was the person doing at that time? So I would rather know that, between X and Y, you were out of the workforce on maternity leave, or, in some other job that didn't have research. I'd also say in your CV allows you to have some commentary. So you could, at the very beginning of your publication section, have a little paragraph that gives some of that commentary. And just as an example, I used to include a statement, because in our field, how in the clinical fields, the senior author is either the first author or the last author, whereas in our field of behavioural science and psycho-oncology, it used to be that the order of authors was literally around the importance. So the first one was first, the second one was second, etc. So I used to have a statement at the beginning of my publications section that basically explained that, so that when people were reading and saw that I was second or third, that actually that was more important than being last. So in your CV, because you've got the space to do that, just include some of that commentary. I think it's quite reasonable to do that. And I think it's quite reasonable to say that publications are limited due to your largely clinical role, or during these particular years, you held, predominantly a clinical role. So publications are limited in that time frame. So just to give that as a bit of a commentary, I think is fine in your CV.
Okay, cool.
Does
Thank
that
you.
answer that?
It does. It does. I wasn't sure whether that was allowed in the CV.
Yeah. A CV basically, other than NHMRC being quite pedantic about what you can and can't include in terms of timeframes and length, your CV can actually be a bit more descriptive. So your CV is the place to talk about things that are going to explain why you're the person for that particular job or grant or whatever. So it's fine to have a longer CV with that commentary, because particularly as a reviewer, I would find that helpful, because again, rather than second guessing, was the person out of the workforce because they got sacked and couldn't get another job? Well, no, you were actually on, a clinical position, or you were on maternity leave or whatever, or you were caring for someone, is far more important for me to understand than guessing as to why you have 3 years missing out of that time frame. So use your CV as a way of communicating, again, without oversharing, but that stuff that you've just talked about is actually quite important to include.
Some people have had to hop off, but I would like you to answer one more question, Afa, that's there. But just for people, if they have to leave, we are recording this and it will be available on our Income Institute Postdoc webpage. I have put the link in the chat, and I will also send a PDF copy of the presentation to the people who have registered. So thanks, Afaf, for agreeing to share that. And so if people have to hop off, please feel free. But there is one last question that's in the chat from Shadma. If it's sort of, if you can't get it, then I'll read it out.
Is it the one about build a collaboration for 2 lead scientists for a grant?
That's the one. Yeah.
Or just an ongoing project? How can you highlight your role in building that collaboration? Shadma, do you want to give me an example of what you mean? I can see that you're on there.
Yes, Professor Afaf, thank you so much for your time today.
That's all right, pleasure.
Beautifully. So when I say now artificial intelligence is a very important role in every sort of clinical as well as translational projects. Suppose we build collaboration overseas with a different project, which may not be my key or niche area, but I have that collaboration and I see that that person could be helpful, and the other side might be seeking something with that sort of skill. So I try to make a repo for both of those people across the sites and organize meetings. Like it will be, say, a month job for me with a couple of meetings, but then eventually my role will be very just to introduce, and then they are doing well. But I am keen to do that. I'm very passionate about building relationships, not only with me, but for the people who can be helpful to each other. So this but as I'm going, I'm seeing it requires lots of time from yourself. So is there any section where we can highlight this sort of relationship you have built, which is fruitful, which have outcomes?
So, I mean, do you mean in your CV or say in the 2-pager that's required for something like an NHMRC grant? You're thinking about your CV right now?
I think more in the 2 pages because...
Okay. So in the 2-pager, that would definitely be something that goes in the collaborators section. So there's a section specifically in that NHMRC list that talks about collaborators. And, you know, what you could do is highlight the fairly integral role that you're playing in bringing particular, and you can name the collaborators, but you have to find a way of saying why that's important. So you can say you played a key role, or you developed the collaboration between blah and blah, which is going to be or has been integral in progressing the work on whatever it is. So you'll see that in the examples that in the bits that I pulled out of my 2-pager, I've highlighted some things like that, but that would be the place to put it in the 2-pager, in the collaborators section. There's another, what's the other section? Hang on, just there's, oops, I lost you, no. The other section that might go in is yeah, maybe also in community engagement and participation. So that's, you know, in my particular 2-pager, I've talked about effective engagement with end users and working with organisations that could then facilitate the next steps. So there's a couple of spots where you might be able to include that, or even contributions to the field. Yeah, what have I just done? I've still got you. What I would do is I'd just try writing it in a paragraph, because it's hard until you actually try and write what it is that you're aiming to convey, and then you'll be able to see which section it goes best into. And look, I'm happy to help you with that if you want to have a bit of a draft and flick it, and I can see what the wording looks like and where it might best fit.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Okay, so I might wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Afaf, for giving us your time and sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience. It's been a fantastic presentation. So thank you again.
Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll PDF and I'll send that straight to you.
Great, and I'll share it with the people who've registered.
Okay, good luck everyone.
Right.
Go and do your CVs. Go and update your CVs.
Goodbye.
Okay, bye.